Today's topic is a little bit more advanced than usual. What I'm going to be showing you how to do is override the behavior of an existing class. So here I have a product model, and this has a validates presence of price validation in it. And I also have a product test case, which basically has a test for checking this validation, make sure that when a product is created, that the price validation check is performed. But I also have this other test, and this test is completely unrelated. All it does is just create a couple products with a name, and then checks if the findOrdered method returns those products in alphabetical order. But notice that I'm creating these products and I'm not passing a price attribute to them. So now I made this test pass, but this test fails now because if I go to my auto test back in the background here, you can see that I get a price can't be blank error because I'm not passing a price attribute to it. There's a couple ways around this common problem, and one way is to have a external hash, basically of valid attributes for a product model, and keep that up to date as you add validations, and always use that hash when creating a product. But I want to look at an alternative, and that is to temporarily disable the ActiveRecord validations entirely. What I'm thinking of doing is, let's say I add a block method here. Let's call it disable validations. And then I could throw this code in there, and then that will resolve the error because validations won't take place in that little block. That'd be pretty cool. I'm sure there's probably reasons you wouldn't want to do this, but it'll make a very nice experiment in overriding the behavior of ActiveRecord. So we need to implement this disable validation method. We could do that in our test helper. That's a good spot so that it will be available to all tests. So accept a block, so we'll yield to that block. And now we want to disable the ActiveRecord validations and then enable them after the block. And as far as I know, ActiveRecord doesn't allow you to do this, so I'm just going to, we basically need to implement a way, but I'm just going to call ActiveRecord base disable validation. And we'll need to make these class methods ourselves. Disable and enable validation. Okay. And Ruby's really cool because it allows you to override a class, any class, and extend, add behaviors, add methods, change methods, whatever you want to do in that class. It's very flexible. So we could override ActiveRecord base here, and then add our little methods in here, our class methods for disabling and enabling validation. Then we also need to override the validation checking and make sure that it doesn't happen if the validation is disabled. But it's not a good idea to do this inside of our ActiveRecord base class. Something at all remotely complex like this should really belong in its own module. And then you include that module in the class. And so let's call include validation disabler. Let's call it that. So we need a new module here called validation disabler. And we need to create a couple class methods in here, disable validation and enable validation. And to create class methods in a module is a little bit tricky because the include keyword, it just takes the methods in here and turns them into instance methods, not class methods. To create class methods, a convention to get around this is to create a second module in here called class methods. And you'll see this all over the Rails source code. And add a couple methods in here. Let's do the disable validation method, which let's set a class variable, set that to true, and enable validation, set it to false. And I'm going to create one more method here for accessing the validation, disable validation method. Accessing that variable. Okay, so we added 3 class methods, but these aren't truly class methods yet. They're just little methods in a module. We need to make them class methods. And to do that, there's a really cool method we can override in a module called included, self.included. And this passes a module or class to it. So in our ActiveRecord base class, we call include validation disabler. When this gets triggered, it will automatically call included here, and it will pass the ActiveRecord base class to this as a parameter. This means we can call class eval on this and basically perform any kind of actions that we want. So any kind of code we throw in here, it's almost just like as if that code existed in ActiveRecord base itself. So what this allows us to do is call extend on the class methods module. If you recall correctly, extend is very similar to include, but it makes them class methods. So it will take these methods in here and put them in ActiveRecord base as class methods. So then we can call them directly up here like this. Okay, let's check our auto test and see if we broke anything significant. Let this run again. And we're getting the same error, validation failed, price can't be blank. So that's all fine because there's no different errors. So far what we're doing is working. We just haven't overridden the actual validation yet. There's this method in ActiveRecord base called valid. And what this does is it performs a validation check, and it either returns true or false, depending on if the record passed validation. Now everything in ActiveRecord goes through this. So if we can override this method and have it always return true when we disable validation, then we can change the behavior of how ActiveRecord validation takes place. So to do that, you shouldn't actually override a method directly like this. Instead, a much better way is to use a technique called alias method chain. And what this does is, it takes two parameters. It has the name of the method you want to override, so let's call it valid. And then the kind of a name of what you want to add to the method. In this case, I wanted to add a disable check. So what this does is does some aliasing magic in the background. And now we create a new method called valid with disable check. So it takes this parameter without the punctuation and this parameter, second parameter, and sticks the word with in between them. And now this method will now become the new valid method which we're overriding. What's really cool about this is that it has another method through aliasing that it created called valid without disable check. Now this method performs the old original validation check, which was the valid method that we're overriding. So this is kind of a self-descriptive way of overriding the behavior of a method, and is extremely useful and extremely cool. So whenever you need to change the behavior of an existing method, just use alias method chain for doing that. So if we just leave this as itself, all by itself, then it will perform what the old validation did because we're calling valid without disable check. But we want to change the behavior a little bit. We want to check if the validation is disabled. So we need to call class validation disabled because that's a class method. And if it is, we want to return true. Otherwise, we want to perform the old validation without the disable check. There's one last little thing I need to do here, and that is set a default value for the disable validation class variable. Set it to false by default. Okay, let's check our auto test and see if this is working so far. Oh good, our test is passing now. So hopefully I didn't lose you in there. I covered a lot of ground, a lot of code, and it's a fairly advanced topic, but I encourage you to watch this episode a couple times if you didn't fully grasp it, and And get familiar with object-oriented programming because it really helps in areas like this. Learn the difference between classes and instances, and class methods and instance methods, and class variables and so on. Because I'm using all those techniques in what I'm doing in this overriding of this behavior here. And also get familiar with alias method chain. I'll put some resources in the show notes, which you can find at RailsCasts.com about that as well. So hopefully you learned something in this little fun experiment. So now we have our disable validation block method that we can call and to disable the ActiveRecord validations. It's pretty cool. I recently did a screencast for simplyinvoices.com. I highly recommend you check them out. It's really cool because what Simply Invoices does is communicate directly with your Basecamp project, fetches the times you worked on your project, and then creates an invoice from them automatically. Just go to simplyinvoices.com and click on the See It in Action button to check out the screencast I made for them.